All right, hello guys. So we are going to take a look at our week 4 homework problem number 10. So week 4 homework is always an interesting one because we introduce and start working with the idea of fractions. All right, it's definitely something that takes a little bit of time to get used to, but as you'll hopefully see, there are some tricks that we can learn, and the quicker that we get those down, the better off we'll be. So the problem we're going to take a look at here, we are subtracting two fractions. So we have negative 7 over 20 minus 1 over 5. So one of the things that we always need to remember is that if we are ever adding or subtracting two fractions, you always have to have a common denominator. So that's always going to be our very first step when we are adding or subtracting fractions. So this kind of takes us back to a week ago when we were looking at least common multiples. All right, so the least common denominator is the least common multiple of all of your denominators. So in this case, we need to find the least common multiple of 20 and 5. All right, and in this case, the least common multiple between 20 and 5 is 20. So we know that our common denominator then is going to be 20. So what we want to do is we want to rewrite what we originally had, which in this case was negative 7 over 20 minus, and we have 1 over 5. And now for each of the fractions that do not contain your common denominator, remember we decided that the LCM, or the least common multiple between 20 and 5, was 20. So this denominator already is 20. However, we see this denominator over here on the right is not 20. So the question that we need to ask ourselves now is, what do we have to multiply 5 by in order for it to become 20? And the answer here is 4. But whatever you multiply your denominator by, you also need to multiply your numerator by that same value. All right. And what we should hopefully see here, guys, and the reason that this works, is that notice that what we are multiplying 1/5 by is actually just the number 1, because 4 over 4 is the number 1. So we're not changing the value of 1/5, because 1/5 times 1 is just 1/5. So in other words, whenever we go ahead and multiply this out, we're just going to be looking at another way to write 1/5. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we end up getting here. So remember, this first fraction already had our common denominator of 20, so we did not need to rewrite it at all. Our second fraction here, whenever you're multiplying two fractions, remember you multiply straight across. We have 1 times 4, that is 4, all over, and denominator times denominator. 5 times 4 is 20. Okay, so basically what we're seeing here, guys, is that 1/5 is the same thing as 4/20. And we can see that if we pull up a calculator, just so we can look at the decimal value. And you'll see the decimal value between those two fractions is in fact the same thing. Alright, so 1/5, that's the same thing as 1 divided by 5. Notice that that is 0.2. And now if we take 4/20, or 4 divided by 20, you'll see that we get the same thing. Alright, so these two fractions represent the exact same value. It's just written a little bit differently. We see it a little bit differently. Alright, so we've obtained our common denominator. And anytime that you are adding or subtracting fractions, the other trick that you need to remember is that after you get your common denominator, that is always going to be the denominator of your answer. Alright, so in other words, this subtraction that we're doing here, the denominator is not affected by that subtraction at all. However, it is the numerators that are affected by the subtraction. And that's what we now need to do. We need to take our numerators here and perform the operation on them. So we have a negative 7 minus 4. All right, so remember that subtracting is the same thing as adding the opposite value here. So negative 7 minus 4 is the same thing as negative 7 plus a negative 4. So in this case, that is going to be, excuse me, let me change back to the correct color. So negative 7 plus a negative 4 is going to be a negative 11. So this would be our final answer then, negative 11/20.